Spring is in the air, I think.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here, and thank you for those on the live stream too for tuning in. So since we're a pretty small group, I'd like to just go around the room and just do some basic introductions. And I guess the question I have is, what brought you here? What questions, what might have attracted you about the specific topic or title? And please say your name as well for the group.
Well, my name is Carl Underhill. My wife and I live in Hudsonville, and I'm attracted to subjects such as was advertised here, but Catholic morality is fine. I like the spiritual dimension of issues like that, and lessons from others, mystics, and from people like you that I can refine in my own life. So that's my interest.
Thank you.
I'm Marion Simmons. I worship at the cathedral, thanks with the Paulus, and I was interested again in the morality part, but I was also very curious regarding the happiness subject, because I guess for me, as I've aged, as well as I think earlier in my life, that I believe we're not put on this earth to be happy. We're put on this earth to serve God, and again, that can then ultimately bring you happiness. But it's, I think there's a limit, a goal, and a fine line there. So I was interested in hearing what you say.
All right. Yeah, well, thank you for sharing.
I'm Karen Wasick, and I go to St. Anthony in Grand Haven. And what brought me to this class, I just feel to get a better understanding of maybe why our world right now just seems to be heading towards more immorality.
Okay.
And so what as a Catholic, besides the Ten Commandments, going beyond that, stretching beyond that, what I can maybe follow and maybe encourage other people.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, we'll definitely get into that. Thank you.
John Williams with St. Thomas the Apostle. I'm an RCIA catechist. And the next topic I have to present is temptation and sin. And I thought I do a lot of reading, and then I came across Catholic morality, theology. I said, well, maybe that would kind of broaden what we talk about in RCIA.
Okay. Wonderful, thank you.
I'm Dorothy Square, and I'm a member of St. Andrews, and there were a group of us that were in a study group about a book that we were reading, and we got into a discussion the other night, the last evening, of sin and what it is, and there's the Ten Commandments, like this lady mentioned, and so I guess I'm looking for, okay, we're all sinners, but what is sin? What is this definition of a sin? In the Catholic Church. I'm a convert, so I've only been a Catholic since 2010, so I wasn't raised in a Catholic church.
Okay, well, thank you.
I'm just curious,
Yeah.
and I'd like to know what everyone thinks about it.
Hopefully we get to that answer before we run out of time today. But yeah, absolutely, we'll explore that.
My name is Jenny. I work for St. Mary's Church here in downtown, and I'm always trying to learn a little more and kind of grow myself. But as I work with a large community, probably can use what I learned to pass it on.
All right, well, thank you very much. So now I'll share a little bit about my own motivation for why I want to present this topic. I think back to, I've been a lifelong Catholic. I've been very active in the church, even when I was in high school. And I went to a lot of youth conferences, and we'd go on these retreats, and they, talk about all these sins and how to avoid sin and resist temptation. And I was a pretty good kid, so I was like, yeah, okay. And then it's like, so what? So what comes after this? What's next? What, what's kind of the next step about what this whole spiritual life is? Because I felt like a lot of it was just, we go on these retreats, we're kind of separated from the world, and it's all about being in a different space. So I was thinking more, well, how do we actually live, good Christian lives in the real world? So that's one kind of question I've been struggling with, because it's very easy for the church just to talk about don't sin, don't sin, don't sin, but for most people they're also asking, well, what's the next step about living the good life? What does that look like? Another thing that comes up is whenever I go to confession, I oftentimes see these pre-written examinations of conscience, and they oftentimes do the 10 Commandments. So just trying to think about sin beyond the 10 Commandments and thinking about, because I do challenge myself when I go to confession, and just trying to think about, again, what's the deeper life? What's that deeper sense of conversion that we're all called to? And then on top of that, we're in the holy season of Lent, so I figured nothing more appropriate than to talk about our understanding of sin and conversion. And one more thing, I'm in my 5th year of the seminary, and 3 years ago I took the Introduction to Moral Theology class that graduate students take. So it's been a while and I'm a bit rusty, so I've also used this class as a chance to brush up. Most of it's going to come from this textbook called Introducing Moral Theology. So you're basically going to get what most seminarians get in foundational moral theology. The difference being this is just going to be an hour and a half tonight, an hour and a half next week, and we take a full semester. So we're not going to cover all of it, unfortunately. That would be a bit of a challenge, but hopefully all this can make for a more fruitful Lent, and in turn we can take what we learn to our parishes and the various ways that we educate and serve others in the faith. So with that said, let's just take a moment and ask the Lord's blessing on this evening in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Good and loving God, you draw us together from many different parishes, many different communities here in Grand Rapids. And we ask that you bless this evening. We ask that you guide us to a deeper understanding of the beauty of your creation, of the beauty of humanity, of the wonderful dignity that we all have, and help guide us that we may serve each other. And we pray all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So let's just dive into the definition of morality. Morality is all about how we live out desires. Does that seem simple enough? So why do people act? Why do people do what they do? Why do people do one thing and not the other? At the root of it is we're all driven by some sort of inner desire, some sort of inner action that's calling us. And this goes to show that everyone has some sort of a morality. Not to say that it's the right morality, but everyone operates by some code of ethics for themselves. And everyone has desires, and everyone acts on them in one way or another. They could choose to live them out, or they could choose not to. So it's important when we think about morality, we often think about the actions, we think about the external things, but we are going to take this a little bit deeper and think about desire. So with that being said, what are some things that people desire? What are the things that drive people's actions? And I'll go ahead and write some of these ideas down on the board. I like to make this very interactive, so I like to hear what y'all like to hear.
How about food?
Food. Yep.
Love.
Love.
Safe shelter.
Food, clothing, and shelter.
Yep, yes.
Do you remember when we learned that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I think I learned it in 1st grade. Food, shelter, clothing. Okay, so we got, I would imagine most of us here have sufficient food. We're all wearing clothes. I presume we all have a place to sleep. Are we happy? Are we content? So, is it just food, or are there varying degrees of food or different types of food.
Mhm.
So we desire food, but there's
Different levels. I mean, food for survival
Mhm.
is different than comfort food for soothingness or whatever
Yeah.
you want to call it.
Food for the soul,
food for the soul. So that would be
what's that under?
Spirituality.
love. Yeah, spirituality. So the spiritual longing. Spirituality. All right. Love. Yeah, we talked about love. That's the proverbial question. What is love? What does it mean that when people desire love?
Various aspects, but I like to include there's friendships that are
Friendships.
important
Yeah. And why?
at different levels.
And why do people desire friendships?
To feel accepted and a part of something.
Okay. Yeah. To feel accepted.
It's
And
it's
to
not a
share our lives.
it's not a journey by oneself. It's not a lonely.
Yeah. So companionship.
Mm-hmm.
So you said the word lonely. Do people desire to feel lonely?
Just the opposite.
Alone, but not lonely.
Yeah. I think quite often many actions are driven out of that inner loneliness and that sense of, well, what does it take to feel accepted? What can we do to feel accepted? People act out of desires for food. Any other desires?
The material things, possessions,
Mm-hmm.
power.
Power. That's a good, power. Philosophers love to think about
Yeah.
what that means.
Well, we see it like lately with all these country leaders that they just want to hold on into power,
Mhm.
and it's just terrible why they can't let go. I mean, this.
Yeah, so do people desire power for power's sake, or is there something deeper to that?
Well, I think
Longing for power.
different levels, power for
Control.
power's sake, but a lot of people can use the power to help.
Yeah.
Control. So power is instrumental. It might not necessarily be the end. It could be
Yeah.
power for the sake of helping other people. So if I had the power to stop gun violence, I would be more than happy to do that. But do people in power use it for altruistic ends, or what other ways do they use?
For their own benefit.
Well,
Yeah.
there's, are you thinking of self-serving power?
Yeah, self-serving power as well. So.
Ego-driven, maybe, or something?
Mhm. So a lot of people like to feel everything's in control. A lot of people
Yeah.
don't like uncertainty, and I would say that's from a deeper inner fear, perhaps. So sometimes people have this inner fear, and then they exercise it in trying to control everything, so they don't have to face. So any other desires that people have? There's a big one I imagine most high school and college students would put on this list.
Joy, happiness.
Joy, happiness, anything else?
Sex.
Yeah, here you go.
I think you were pushing.
Yeah, of course. Joy, happiness. So there's all sorts of desires, and as you can see, we can say, well, I'd like joy. Well, what is joy? And then you start getting into deeper levels of, well, is it being with people you can tell jokes with? Is it being with people that you can do fun things like you go on a nice hike or enjoy beauty or nature? Is it people you can watch a movie with? People you don't necessarily feel alone, or so people live out joy in different ways. But you can see what drives people in many ways is ultimately these desires that they have. It's important to be attentive to the different desires that people have. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about, going back. So morality is how we live out these desires. So it's a question of what controls, what drives the ways we live out desires. And as Catholics and as Christians, we also are asking questions, what is a good way to do this and what's a not so good way. So where do rules come from? Where do obligations come from? And the textbook that I'm using it's called Introducing Moral Theology by Dr. William Madison. He brings up this example from one of Plato's dialogues. I think it was the Republic. And it's this story that's called the Ring of Gyges. And the character presents this fable, and he says there was a shepherd who once found this ring that had the power to make him invisible. And then it goes into this hypothetical. What would he do with such power? So the argument that this character makes in Plato's book is that the shepherd used the ring to seduce the queen, kill the king, seize the kingdom for himself. He basically used this power of invisibility for self-serving ends. And his argument is, if we could be invisible, if we could do whatever we wanted without any consequence, so without anyone else holding us accountable, he sees us on this trajectory that we would just try to seize as much power as possible. And because we would do that, and because we don't want to be hurt by other people in power, societies come together, people agree to live by certain principles, people agree to have these duties to one another. But that's ultimately because they don't want to get hurt by those who are in power. So the idea of morality is basically, it's people are going to be self-serving, and duty comes from this obligation to because in our self-serving nature, we don't want to get hurt if we're the weak ones. So we all kind of agree to live by this code. So that's more of this is called a morality of obligation, kind of a principle of obligation. And it says we have the duty to limit our powers and to prevent ourselves from getting hurt by others. And philosopher Immanuel Kant says, act only according to the maxim by which you can also will that it would become a universal law. So basically saying, don't do anything that you wouldn't want anyone else doing. Which is basically saying, okay, yeah, so I might be, in this position of power or influence, but I have a duty, because we all live together in this society, because I don't want someone else to hurt me. I'm going to try to live in a way that I wouldn't want to, that I wouldn't hurt other people. And this sounds kind of like the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself. So this is pretty admirable. But going back to this example of what would happen if we were invisible, does this story ring a bell for anyone? Which, what does it remind you of? And I put a hint right there. So there's the Lord of the Rings. Yeah. So the Lord of the Rings is the journey of the temptation to use the ring to exercise power for selfish ends, and just how tough it is to resist that. So it's that allure of power, and to be honest, I'm not an expert on the Lord of the Rings. There's also Harry Potter and the invisibility cloak. And you know what's the rule for... no, I'm sorry, that was the Marauder's map that I was thinking about. That they have to promise that they're up to no good in order to use it. But the invisibility cloak as well. So that's another thing. So time and again in movies and culture, we really look at the question, if we were powerful, what would we do? And some people seem to think that there's just this fundamental orientation or inclination in humanity that kind of power just wants more power. And the whole point of morality, the whole reason why morality exists, or why proper morality or why Catholic morality exists, is to put limitations on that power. But it's not because of anything besides the question of, well, is that how I would want to be treated if I were the weak one? And, yeah.
Does it fit anywhere, Paolo, is when my daughters were very small and trying to teach them the right thing to do. I remember saying again, you know, if no one sees you other than God, we can. What are you going to do? Are
Yeah.
you still going to take the money that's not yours, or are you going to leave the money? But it's not because of what other people are going to see you do. What if just you are there by yourself?
And that's the ultimate question. That's the question, is say, do we only act in good ways because other people are holding us accountable?
Right.
Or is there something deeper
It's hard.
from
Right.
which it springs?
Yes.
And this argument is saying, no, the only thing is, you know, I wouldn't want my money taken, so it's that kind of reciprocal trade-off. It's that compromise, that social
Right.
contract.
That's
This is
right.
one view.
Uh-huh.
Now, what I would have liked to do is, there's this segment on Jimmy Fallon called Celebrities Read Mean Tweets. And it's basically on the internet, we're living in a world with a lot of anonymity. So a lot of people can create these profiles where they don't have to show their real name. And we're seeing a lot of ugliness. We're seeing a lot of people hide behind that, you know, when there's no one there to hold them accountable and say, John Smith, why did you say that?
Yes.
We're seeing a lot of ugliness come out. So that's an interesting argument kind of in favor of this model, to say that people are only moral because they know there's going to be consequences for what they do. And that's one model of morality, is it's how do we try to limit the damage or limit the harm. And the model I kind of use for this is kind of like, if you're on the road, you know, so we all got these different desires. And sometimes our desires conflict or bump into one another, so, you know, I'd like a lot of stuff. It'd be nice if I could just steal someone else's money so I could buy new shoes or whatever it is I need. But I don't do that because then that person will get mad at me, and I wouldn't want someone else, you know, stealing my money. And so, you know, we're all kind of living out our desires, but the whole idea of what are the obligations that we need in society? What are the rules that we have in society so we don't crash into one another when we're all trying to pursue our longing or our will? And this is one model of morality, but it's basically saying, you know, we're all trying to get to different places, and, you know, just kind of stay in your lane, just follow the rules, you know, come up with the rules of the road so we don't bump into one another.
Well, every society has their own set of rules that if you don't go by, then you will
Yeah.
experience the consequences, like go to jail.
Absolutely. So rules are important. You know, we see why all these cars are going to different starting points, different endpoints, and we see how rules are helpful to help people get to different places and different end goals. But this sounds sufficient for morality for Catholic Christians that believe in a.
Not just
Well, it doesn't say much about humankind, does it? I mean, if we're so base as to seek our own desires, that we must have these rules to keep us straight and narrow, it doesn't say much for our ability to act on our own.
Yeah, and it doesn't put that much. It's one thing to have external rules, which I'm sure practically everyone can agree. You know, we need speed limits. We need to know who yields right away. You know, we need to have rules for transactions, that sort of thing. The other question is, and this doesn't say that we defer to external rules in every situation. You still need to use your reason and intellect to kind of guide you. But if you think that all you're using your reason and intellect for is so that you don't step on someone else's toes, or you try to live out in a way, because you can get into some complicated questions. But this is one way of thinking, is it's, you know, how can I live in such a way that I would want it to be universalized? And that's my duty. Like, as a human, that's the duty or the obligation that I have to do. I can go around about pursuing my desires and all that, but I have to kind of temper it with that question: how do I keep it from being, or how do I do this in a way that it could be universalized?
We have to respect each other, no?
This is one model of morality, but this actually isn't what's been the goal of Catholic morality. So there's another approach to morality, and that is looking at the ultimate end of happiness. So before we go into that, let's talk about what are some traits of happy people. Give me some ideas or examples of what kind of people are happy.
I think they're easygoing. They don't get upset real fast.
Okay, easygoing.
Optimistic.
Optimistic.
They're fun to be around.
Yeah, so that's kind of
Yes.
easygoing.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Respect other people.
They respect others.
Respect and concern for others.
Yeah, they have concern for others.
I think people who are self-confident and love themselves, as we should do, that they're able to come across and respect other people better because they have the self-confidence of their own beliefs, I guess.
So love your neighbor as yourself. If you have a deep and profound love for yourself, then that flows into how you can best love your neighbor.
How about sense of selflessness?
Selflessness. Why does that make people happy?
I think of it as a giving heart, a share in my good fortune with those who are less fortunate. It's not a me first. It's a recognition that it takes a lot to make the world go round. You know, and it's not me first. The world doesn't center on me, mine, and my paycheck.
Yeah, that's very true.
One definition that I have heard about happiness is the willing the what is willing the well-being of others and doing something about it. I forgot the first.
Yeah,
word.
willing the well-being of others.
Yeah, and doing something about it. I think if you give something to other people and just by seeing them happy, it's just a compensation of, that's your, so to speak, your pay, that when you give something to a family in need or they're so happy that you feel happy about giving.
And what desire does that go to? If we talk about desire motivating actions, where
Well, that would be also tricky.
what's the desire that would be the root of that?
Of what? The people
Of being selfless, giving,
selfless, okay.
Love.
love. So you could talk about people desire love in the sense of being loved, in the sense of having people acknowledge their presence, think about their well-being, show their concern, show their affection, being there to listen. And you can also think of people desire the well-being of others. So you could think of love in those two dimensions, which ultimately we live out love in both of those dimensions. But there's one in which your desire is centered in yourself. There's another in which your desire kind of flows out to other people. And when we think about happy people, we weren't necessarily talking about, the happy person's the one that has the most exquisite gourmet meals. When I think of happiness, I think of good dinners with friends. So oftentimes there's a food component to it. But we're not saying, the happiness is the one with the best form of shelter.
It's
with the
actually
big house.
relationships.
Yeah, connection, relationships.
The food might be a medium,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the relationships. It's the laughter, it's the stories, it's the interaction at the table.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
the relationship. I think life is about relationship, meaningful relationship. One aspect of friendship, if you seek a friend, be a friend. You have to be intentional about it, deliberate. Open doors,
Yeah.
seek new opportunities, new experiences, try different things.
So-
Come to the information center and sit in Paolo's class, you know, things like that.
Yeah. So happy people love themselves, and from that it flows into this kind of proactive, you know, I'm going to take the first step. I'm going to try the new friendship. I'm going to, you know, make the first offering of to do something, to build connections with others. You're not the ones that just wait for others to come to them, if that makes sense. So the ancient Greeks, including Aristotle and Plato, as depicted here, they said that the good life is not the life of power. It's not the life of just diving into every desire and using power to satisfy, or to try to satisfy every desire that you have, like the one who would have the ring of invisibility. But it's about living a life of excellence. It's about saying, you know, what does it mean to be happy? Not what does it mean to have the power to scratch every itch, but what does it mean to be happy? And then how do we act on our desires in pursuit of an ultimate end of happiness? The ultimate end is not just the desire in front of me, but it's that second step. So we talk about, well, you know, people need food, and that's a good thing. We can get food plus fellowship if we invite friends over for dinner, and if we share, and if people bring new recipes, and if we have a discovery of different culinary tastes and talk about our days and all that fun stuff. So it's one thing to look at, you know, the immediate desires, and it's another thing to look at what's the ultimate end. And for the ancient Greeks, for the Christians, for many Catholics in this day and age, the answer to what is good, you know, what is morality, what does it ultimately center around? It's that question of happiness. And it's that question of how do we act on our desires in pursuit of our own happiness and in pursuit of the happiness of others. And ultimately it's that sense of our own happiness is incomplete unless we're helping out with the happiness of others. And as I said, this is a deeply Christian concept, especially in John's Gospel and the writings of John. So Jesus says, "A thief comes only to steal and slaughter and destroy. I came so they may have life and have it more abundantly." So it's that question of abundant life. You know, going back to those desires, we talk about food, clothing, shelter, and all that. I'd say at its core, a lot of people just have a desire to live. And that's especially true among people who are chronically sick or maybe even terminally sick. There's that fundamental desire for life beneath all our other desires. And oftentimes the people who want power and control and this and that, they're ultimately looking at that question of how can I preserve my life? And, you know, I'm going to preserve my life by making the most money so I can buy the best healthcare and the best doctors and the best treatments out there. And or, you know, they think if I can control everything else, then maybe I can control my health. But that's one of those ultimate desires that we have, you know, abundant life. And then Jesus also says, "I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. This is my commandment. Love one another as I love you." So love tied to the question of joy, love flowing out to other people. Not necessarily being loved, which is extremely important, but also that second step of giving love. And then one of my favorite quotes in the whole New Testament, this quote from the first letter of John. "There's no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. So no one who fears is not yet perfect in love." And that's that question of, are we moral because we're afraid of punishment? Are we moral? Do we act out of a sense of duty to others? Do we try to do the bare minimum that we can get away with? What do we do when no one else is looking? But it's that question of perfect love. And perfect love being able to overcome fear. And that's also one of, when we talk about our deepest desires, people have a deep desire to avoid any fear possible. And Jesus is telling us the way to overcome fear is through love. It's not through dominance, power, control, all those other questions. It's that question of love. So this is just to help center. This isn't to say that obligations and duties to other people aren't important, because we certainly live by rules and whatnot. But if it just becomes an unmitigated pursuit of your own desire without a question of what's the deeper sense of happiness that we're all called to, then the morality is incomplete. And you can get into a lot of trouble if all you try to do is just figure out the bare minimum to just keep people from clashing into one another. So the image I like to use, and I just came up with this, so something like a symphony. Something like, it's not like we're all on the freeway, we're all trying to get where we're going, but how can we belong to something bigger than ourselves? How can we contribute? How can we flourish? How can we enjoy beauty? And that's also to say that order, guidance is necessary. People play different roles. People come in and exit at different points. But I think that's the ultimate model of happiness. Or this is one way to kind of conceive of what would the happy life look like. It's where we're all flourishing in our own particular gifts, talents, and skills. And in our own flourishing, we get to appreciate beauty and joy around us. We get to feel this connection, and we feel this transcendence that we're more than just the sum of our individual desires and appetites and that sort of thing. So this is the other vision of morality, looking at morality of happiness. Any questions so far? So now we'll talk a little bit about what makes moral actions. And as humans, we interact with our world using our intellects, our emotions, our bodies, and our freedom. So I love this scripture passage from the first letter to the Thessalonians. I use it a lot in my ministry when I'm praying with people who are sick. May the God of peace himself make you perfectly holy, and may you entirely spirit, soul, and body be preserved blamelessly for the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. So that sense of, we have a body, so we do have physical appetites, we do enjoy food, we do enjoy physical things. We also have a soul, which is to say that we have a dignity that is, closely, it's the form of the body, but it's not to say that it's identical to the body. We have the soul that's indivisible, and then we also have a spirit that calls us outward. It kind of draws us beyond ourselves. Which is to say, especially for people who are sick and people who are suffering, without diminishing any of the suffering, we can also see that they have a dignity and they have this soul that is, perfect and beautiful, even in spite of their physical problems, and even in the midst of their suffering and the difficulty, they have that spirit that draws them out. So we have an intellect, we have emotions, we have our bodies, and we also have freedom. And the freedom is one of the most crucial things, because animals can be happy or sad, we see that. Animals have bodies. Animals can be pretty cunning and clever to pursue food or to come up with their nests or various places where they inhabit and reproduce. But ultimately, animals tend to act off of instinct, whereas humans have a freedom that goes beyond just acting instinctually, which means that we can control the various ways we act on our desires. And then for moral theologians, this is one of the basics of moral theology. If you look at human actions, they have an object, and that's the external. Anyone can see the object of a moral action. That's what we do. There's also the intention, why we do something. And finally, there's the circumstances. And circumstances can be internal to yourself, and circumstances can be external. But moral actions have these three components. So there's the object, the intention, and the circumstances. Can anyone think of examples of this? I mean, just what's a basic moral action?
Are you thinking of circumstances like my excuse was?
That a lot of people will use it for that, yeah. Or they'll say I don't know. I mean, we need to think of a concrete example here. I mean, the one I've been going back to when I was preparing this. Okay, let's use the example of buying a car. So if someone buys a car, is that a moral act?
Doesn't have to be.
Yeah, well,
Just
if you do an action in the physical world,
yeah.
you're acting out of certain desires, I would argue that it's a moral action. So the object is you buy a car. What's your intention when you buy a car? Or intentions, there could be multiple.
Transportation.
Yeah.
It could be show off.
So it could be purely utilitarian, I just need something to get me from point A to point B.
Independence.
Yeah, independence.
Your image of yourself portrays the image you have of yourself to the world or other people around
Yeah.
you.
So it could be, I just got a promotion, so I'm going to show them who's boss. I'm going to come in a really nice car just to make sure my coworkers know that I'm doing pretty well. So a car can be there, or I'm a young person. I'm not married yet, so I'm gonna show off my salary and make sure that the people I'm dating are able to see how well I'm doing. So, I mean, because when I was working, I drove a 4-door car. A lot of people drove big trucks. A lot of people drove 2-door sports cars. That could be double or even triple how much my car cost. And we were all roughly the same level engineers. So we all did the act of buying a car. Some people, the intention could be, well, it's just kind of fun to race down the road and, super fast acceleration. Other people, it's, well, I have a family, so I need this car to carry my wife and kids. Other people don't. Other people... So there's a variety of intentions, and quite often when we do things, rarely is it as clean as just one, there's a single intention, I would argue. And then there's the circumstances around it. So yeah, I have a great salary, I buy a $30,000 car. Or, my salary's not so good, but I really just want to show people that I'm doing better than they think I am, or I want to keep up with my other friend who's a doctor now, so I buy a $30,000 car. So there's the circumstances. A purchase for one person that may have a lot of disposable income is different for a purchase for another person that may not. And one person may be able to spend the money on the car and also donate a substantial portion of their salary to charity and do other things. Another person may pour, most of their disposable income into a vehicle.
Go broke.
So those are the other circumstances that might be surrounding it.
Is the opposite of morality immorality?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Suppose I was selling you my car,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't tell you about the transmission slips.
Yeah. Yeah.
My circumstance would be, well, he's a young guy, he's got more money than me, I justify that as really an act of making it immoral.
Yeah. When I'm using the word moral action in this situation, that's to distinguish it from just pure instinct. So, you know, if you turn on the lights and then my eye shrinks because my pupil has a reaction, that's instinct. I can't control that. So in a sense, I'm not morally liable for what my pupil does, you know, if the light goes on or off. Or, you know, for people who come down with a bad sickness, oftentimes it's amoral, I guess, or it's not a moral thing, it just happens. We would like to think, oh, maybe it's because of this, or I could have controlled it, or it wouldn't have happened, but a moral action is to distinguish it from pure instinct. And it's moral because we're using our freedom when we do something. We're using our intellect so we can think about the circumstances, we can think about the consequences, we can come up with an intention that's beyond just the action. So, you know, when I'm buying a car, I know what my intentions are. And it's something that's manifest in the physical world, if that makes sense. So that's a moral act, and these are the three components: the object, the intention, and the circumstances. And this is what moral theologians do to evaluate tough questions and whatnot. We're not really going to dive into this much more in this presentation, but this is just more of an introduction to distinguish morality from instinctual stuff. That being said, I hope this shows that a lot of the things we do are actually moral actions. You know, interacting in society, going to the grocery store, you know, do we buy food that is sustainably farmed, or do we buy food that, you know, that people may not be taking care of the environment while they do it? The same would go with cars. You know, there's all sorts of dimensions when we look at what are our intentions when we do something, because our intentions reflect our desires. And it's also the circumstances in which we live that kind of control it. You know, when I go to the store, I can't quite know. Or like, let's say I'm shopping for clothes. You know, practically speaking, I can't find socks that weren't made in a sweatshop. That being, I can't say I've ever tried it, but you know, if you were to go to the store and look at every label on socks and try to trace the supply chain, really difficult. So quite often, you know, we're constrained by the circumstances of we need certain things and we just don't have enough time to figure out how to make purchases that are moral. But that being said, I hope this imbues you with a world that is far more morally relevant than just kind of blind instincts or transactions that we make. And then as I said, one of the main things of our humanity is the question of freedom. So we need to look at what is freedom? What comes to mind when you think of freedom? Without jumping ahead to the other slides that you have.
Ability to choose.
The ability to choose. Yeah. And what gives us the ability to choose things? What's required to make a choice?
Intellect and circumstances.
Yeah. So we need circumstances. So freedom is the ability to choose. Any other takes or ideas of what freedom means?
Well, in the process of choice, there's assigning some value or relevance that this one is a better choice than that one.
Mm-hmm.
And that's based on value or perception of.
Yeah, so
Good.
that's the intellectual process or the intellectual processing
Okay.
of choices. But freedom presupposes a choice. And what does it take to have a choice? The choice means options. So there's two ways to think about freedom. Freedom can be freedom from outside pressure. So, you make a decision because you're acting on your desire. You don't, so let's use buying clothes. My mom could say, yeah, those don't really match, or, that color just doesn't really look good on you. So, am I really free to buy the shirt or whatever it is I'm thinking? Nah, if I know that other people are going to criticize my decision and that sort of thing. So sometimes it can be outside pressure. Sometimes it can be internal habits. So, quite often people say, well, yeah, I am free to go to the gym, but, do I have the capability? Do I, if I'm just in a habit of doing that over and over, or, yeah, I'm free to not be on Facebook, but if I sit down on the couch and I got some time free, am I really going to not go on Facebook if I have my iPad, So we have these habits that can oftentimes constrain our ability to make free choices. So we think we're free, but we have these habits. And oftentimes it's a question of resource limitations. Yeah, I'm free to go out and buy a Ferrari. There's no law prohibiting me. It's perfectly legal, but is the bank going to give me financing for the Ferrari with the money I don't have? Or, can I go buy the house that I want? So quite often we have these resource limitations. So how do people who want to maximize their freedom, what do they do? They quite often seek power, they seek money, they seek ways to overcome these limitations.
Okay.
And the ultimate ideal that quite often our society has is the person with the great salary, the great job, the person that may not be tied down by family obligations, so they can go out and adventure all over the world. They have absolute freedom to see what they want, to buy what they want, to do what they want. That's one model of freedom. And this model of freedom is freedom from different things that restrain us.
I think nowadays we take freedom as the ability to do whatever we want without thinking the consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And it's being responsible, but it's being freedom, doing the right choices. But it's easier to say, well, I think especially in this culture that nobody can tell me what to do.
Mm-hmm.
That attitude that starts since kids,
Yep.
They always say, you can't tell me what to do. I mean, I can see
It's
my kids.
that freedom from outside pressure. So it's, if I feel this, if I feel like I want to do that, I don't have to worry about mom. That's kind of overcoming that sense of guilt or that sense of obligation to other people. But that's not what the church would propose as the truest image of freedom. And this is somewhat contradictory. Or it's not contradictory, but it's somewhat difficult to fully grasp. That's the question of freedom from. Others would look at, if you're free, freedom should be tied to happiness. Like there should be a direct link. So we're free when we're free to pursue happiness, and we're free to resist bad things. So going back to, what makes an action, we use our freedom. And so for us, the ultimate goal is to not be completely unattached to things, but the ultimate goal is to be free to be happy. And sometimes that means there's certain limitations or certain things that might constrain some of our actions. But we view freedom ultimately in relationship to, or in connection to happiness. Okay, any questions so far? So we've been going for about an hour. Would you like to take a break? A little break. So maybe a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 8:05. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about the roots of morality, we'll dive into the concept of virtues. When you think of virtues, what comes to mind? Now, if I said virtue, what does that mean to most people who haven't taken graduate moral theology?
Good actions, good deeds.
Good deeds? Yeah.
Character.
Character.
Yes.
Are deeds and character the same thing?
Sorry, what in character? I didn't hear that.
Are deeds and character the same thing?
I think your character leads to your deeds.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Precisely. So this is kind of this was a difficult concept for me to pick up. The Latin word for a virtue would be a habitus, or the definition would be a habitus. Kind of like habit, but not entirely. A habit is, if we're put into certain circumstances, we tend to do the same things. That would be a habit. If someone who bites their fingernails and can't quite stop doing it, we would view a habit more as repetitive pattern, maybe an addiction, maybe something that people can't quite be totally free from. A virtue is it's someone's disposition. The church's definition is a stable disposition or a firm attitude. So it's kind of like a habit in that if I was in the circumstances, this is how I would act. And it's that space kind of that just before the action occurs. So it's that pattern that kind of drives the action. But that's not to say that they just do it out of pure habit. So actions are complicated. Circumstances change. And we seem to have certain habits that guide us in the midst of various circumstances. So we were in certain circumstances. I could have a lot of money. I could have not that much money. I could have a family to take care of. I could have no one dependent on me. I could have these things. We have certain desires. Going back to the car example, I would want a car because it's fast, because it shows off, because it's utilitarian, because it's good in the snow. All sorts of questions. And then the virtue would be, and we'll go into the various types of virtue, but it would be, what is it that kind of guides or mediates the circumstances and the desires that we have that leads to actions that are good? So virtues are good. And then vices are the same thing except that the consequence or the outcome would be bad. So I'm going to give a concrete example just to help understand a little bit more about virtue. Virtue in the sense of the stable disposition that guides actions. My mother's a nutritionist, so I grew up learning good habits, good practices with eating. So I know that fruit's good for me. And I've learned that in biology, and the older I get, the more I realize fruit is good for you. So I know I should eat fruit. I know that intellectually. Some people would eat fruit out of a sense of duty. The government guidelines say we should eat this much fruit. It was done by scientists that know nutrition, therefore I'm going to eat fruit. But that being said, we eat fruit for other reasons too. That being said, so I know I should eat fruit. To be honest, I don't eat fruit as much as I should. What are the circumstances in which I would eat fruit? Would it be because I'm home and my mother's around, so I want to make my mother feel good, so I'll have a little serving of fruit, with breakfast? Do I only eat fruit when it's convenient? So, for example, if there's a banana in the house, I'll just grab a banana because it's already there. Or if I'm at a function or like a breakfast before a meeting and there's pre-sliced fruit, which is the best because you don't have to fight with it, will I eat fruit? Will I eat fruit when it's inconvenient? So let's say I go home from lunch and I got to get back to the office, kind of busy. There's an orange there. I got to take the time to slice the orange. That takes a lot of effort. Or maybe I'm going to a function and I know that a lot of the meetings we have, a lot of the lunch meetings we have for a certain committee don't have fruit. Am I smart enough to bring fruit ahead of time? Do I understand the value of fruit that much that I'll bring my little lunchbox and have some fruit? What if I don't feel like it? So what if we run out of bananas and all we have are apples in the house? And this happens all the time, by the way. I don't like apples. So I know I should eat fruit, but I'm not going to eat the apple because I got to slice it and I don't like the taste. So I know fruit's good for me. But when we talk about the virtue of eating fruit, in reality I only eat fruit sometimes. I only eat fruit when it's convenient. If we run out, I'm not going to go to the store and buy more bananas. I'm just going to wait. So I don't eat as much fruit as I should. What would be a more virtuous example, someone who has that stable disposition? So I'm disposed to eating fruit. I understand it's good. Am I that stable? Not really. So a more virtuous person when it comes to the good outcome of eating fruit, they would be the ones that plan ahead. Bring a lunchbox. Or they would be the ones that make the extra effort to go out and go shopping on a regular basis. Or they'd be the ones that make the sacrifice and say, I'm just going to eat the apple even though I don't really like it, because I know it's good for me. And I know it's good for my nutrition even though I can't really see it or feel it, that sort of thing. So you can see we have a disposition to do certain things like eat fruit, but there's all these varying circumstances that get in the way. And in some circumstances we might do it, other circumstances we might not. And what's the ideal ultimately? That we can do the best thing across all circumstances, that we're disposed to do it, not just when it's convenient, not just when others are watching, but in those circumstances. So that's an example of the various degrees of how we can live out that. Let me give the other example, and this comes from the textbook. Why do people donate money? So donating money is a good thing, sharing with the less fortunate, helping to make the world a better place. What are the various circumstances in which they do it? Well, maybe your friend's doing a bike race and they say, hey, could you chip in some money? I'm raising money for the MS Foundation. So some people might only donate when they're asked directly by a friend, like person to person. Do I only donate when I'm feeling sorry for others? So maybe I see a commercial on TV and I feel sympathy, or maybe I'm talking to someone on the street and someone asks me and I feel sorry for them in that circumstance. What if I'm walking down the street and I have some friends with me? Or what if I'm sitting in church and I have my family right next to me and the collection basket comes around? Do I donate when others are watching me? And that kind of goes back to the question of when I'm asked. Do I only donate when I'm sure I have the extra money? So Christmas was nice. People, sent me little Christmas cards. I know I have a little extra cash. Is that why I donate? Or there's people that donate when it might mean a sacrifice to a certain pleasure or a certain desire that they might otherwise have. Or people donate when they know nobody else is gonna know what they've given. Some people might be proactive, at the year end and say, okay, it's Christmas time, got to make a list of my charities, got to send out my various checks like I normally do, just because I try to give away a certain percentage of my income. So it's not necessarily tied to, I'm donating when I'm asked or not. And again, those are various ways that we might live out this disposition. It's reflected in actions, but there's that underlying disposition of how do we share our generosity. And that's that question of how do we live out the virtue. That's an example of virtue in the disposition. And I have to make a plug. This is from our website, catholicinformationcenter.org/give. So that's one way to donate. So as you can see, virtues are about more than just knowledge of the rules. So I know that donating is good. I know that eating fruit is good. It's about actions. And quite often it comes from actually doing it. So let's say I start bringing lunch to work. I'll give you, using the fruit example, because this is something that I'm working through myself. I realized it was a challenge that, the bananas would run out, so I bought little plastic cups that have the pre-sliced fruit kind of in the sugar water, and to do that. So that's one example about how I'm trying to become a little bit more virtuous in taking care of my own health and eating more fruit, which I know I'm not doing. So it comes from good role models. So I had a great role model in my mother. And it comes from doing and learning and feedback and saying, well, maybe this didn't quite taste good enough. Maybe I'll try buying a different type of fruit. Or maybe, I'll give you another example this summer. I bought dehydrated mangoes. So that was another example of, I had to work at a hospital, so I had to take my lunch, and if I took the banana, I'd get all bruised. So that's another way of, we learn by doing. And only by doing do we develop these stable dispositions. And it's not enough to say, well, yeah, I had fruit that one time I was at Mom's house and it was nice, so I guess I did a good thing by eating fruit. I'm trying to develop these dispositions of how I can do good. So again, virtues are those stable dispositions for the good. And throughout the history of Western civilization, going back to the Greeks, they came up with what's called the 4 cardinal virtues. It's also known as the 4 human virtues. And in varying orders, this isn't necessarily the be-all, end-all order. There's temperance, and that's all about well-ordered desires. And then there's prudence, that's the virtue of making good decisions. Justice is relating well with others, and fortitude is facing difficulty well. And then there's the Book of Wisdom. The Book of Wisdom says, if one loves righteousness whose works are virtues, she teaches moderation and prudence, righteousness and fortitude. So moderation could be temperance, prudence, righteousness, that's another way of saying justice, and fortitude. So the 4 cardinal virtues are in the Book of Wisdom. This was written about 50 years before Christ, and it's an exploration of Jewish theology and a Greek culture. So it's looking at the Greek culture, but also looking at what is divinely inspired and God's wisdom and presence there. So you can see this comes from the Bible, and this has been a big subject of study, especially by St. Thomas Aquinas, and this runs throughout the Catholic tradition. But that, just because it runs through the Catholic tradition doesn't necessarily mean it only applies to Catholics. Because we're talking about morality in terms of trying to find happiness, and we look at the speculation and the writings of a lot of non-Catholic writers, non-Christian writers, especially the ancient Greeks, we can say that the virtues are universally applicable. It's not necessarily something that's purely Catholic. And Pope John Paul II, in an encyclical called Veritatis Splendor, uses the term inner-worldly, meaning concerning the here and now. And that's different from the theological virtues, or different from things that come through divine revelation, things that extend to heaven, hell, the afterlife. That would be more transcendent. But speaking of inner-worldly, here and now as humans, now just because it's the here and now doesn't mean God's not related. We know that God created humanity, so there is that connection. But we would say that the cardinal virtues would be universal. So earlier we talked about the world and what does Catholic teaching have to say to the world. Hopefully we can try to make a compelling case that the moral life, the good life, the life that we're all called to live, the society that we're called to build, the virtues play a fundamental role in all of that. And hopefully we can dialogue with non-believers. Hopefully we can use human reason. We can use our intellects to come to a deeper understanding of how the virtues help us to discover happiness and lead to the good life. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? the virtues are related. And as we go through the virtues, we're not going to go through all of them because we're not going to have time, but as we go through them, we can understand a little bit more why that's the case. So the first virtue that we'll talk about is temperance. And when you hear the word temperance, quite often people think strict abstinence. So the temperance movement, yeah, you can't touch any alcohol, no more alcohol. So people see temperance in terms of that. But actually, temperance plays a role in helping us to properly enjoy pleasures, in moderation. And temperance is also important to help shape our desires. But thinking about moderation and enjoying pleasures, we all know that, I presume maybe not even through experience, but through understanding, if you drink a lot of alcohol, it has a deadening effect, and you can't really appreciate the complexity or the flavors of fine whiskey after having 5 or 6, if that makes sense. Same with food. If we just gorge on food, it has a certain effect of deadening our ability to enjoy the pleasures afterward. But there's a lot of other pleasures. We didn't really make a full inventory of pleasures on our earlier list of desires. But I was reading this article, and it was saying that there's good evidence that character strength and self-control, which is a sub-virtue of temperance, is more important than IQ as a predictor of academic performance. So it's one thing to say, oh yeah, you're pretty smart, that people who do well in school are smart. But we live in a world with a lot of distractions. And another example of a pleasure, and this is becoming more and more prominent, is online addictions. Not even just the sexual stuff, but video games. Or social media. It's kind of this never-ending, you can just keep scrolling and scrolling, and people can get sucked into these distractions. And I speak of that as one who is eminently distracted by Facebook, putting this presentation together. But that being said, someone can be very smart, but the ones that perform best in school, the ones that can do complex tasks, the ones that are that do well in the workplace, they have to have that ability, that stable disposition to enjoy pleasures in moderation. And one of that can be is to say, I'm talking about the internet now, go back 15 years, television, to turn off the TV, to be able to concentrate, to be able to focus, to be able to think deeply. So that's one example of temperance. And again, it's about ordering desires. So we have all these desires bouncing around in our brains. And temperance is the ability to see what is good within each desire and to see how we can order that well. And the quintessential case that's used throughout college campus ministries and high school and whatnot is how to order sexual desires and how to be temperate and understand the beauty of sexuality in marriage and how to look at the deeper goods, the deeper ends. But temperance isn't just alcohol, it's not just food, it's not just sex. It's also how we spend our time. It's also how we balance our time. There's such a thing as even too much work. A lot of people might be workaholics and not understand maybe you don't need to spend that much time at work if you have a family that you could spend more time with. What's the right balance of spending time with children versus spending time trying to make money? Again, that's a question of desires. Do you desire having a lot of money so you can give your kids a good life? Absolutely. Is it better perhaps to sometimes spend more time with your kids and live a little bit more simply in the other material luxuries? That's also true too. So temperance is just a fundamental virtue through many facets of life. But we don't take time to reflect on how we order these desires. So I gave you some examples. We're running short on time. I'm not going to go any more into the other facets of temperance. But another key point here that is related to temperance, I've talked about desires. Desires often flow out of emotions. And the question is, can emotions be controlled or shaped? A lot of people would think that, well, if I want that, that's just the way I am and might as well go for it. And which is to say, that's to go back to an approach to morality of, as long as I don't hurt anyone else, I'm just going to do what I want to do. But actually, psychologists would say that our emotions and our desires can be shaped and developed. It's not to say control isn't necessarily the best word, but you can help grow and you can form and shape. And the reason is that at its core, emotions are judgments that we make. They could be conscious judgments or they could be unconscious judgments that we make in reaction to certain stimuli or certain responses. And the thing about judgments is that judgments can be shaped or developed with new perspectives, or with new knowledge, and also with new experiences and new examples. For example, I spent the past summer working in a hospital, and I was working as a hospital chaplain, and I was terrified of it. I was absolutely terrified of having to of just having to go into hospital rooms with people I've never met and be with them in these moments that I couldn't understand. Because I like knowledge, I like control, I don't like unpredictability, and I didn't know how people would react emotionally and all that stuff, so I was terrified of it. That being said, I jumped into it, I had some great experiences, and the first time I walked through an ICU, I felt kind of faint. All the beeping, all the noise, just all the chaos of it, I literally felt somewhat faint. That being said, I had several experiences with families in the ICU in various capacities. I've seen people get better. I was with people as they were dying with their families. I saw the power of prayer. I saw the power of being there to comfort them, being kind of a neutral presence, if that makes sense, a stable presence, to show that we're still here breathing, even though your loved one might not be. So to be honest, at the end of the summer, that same stimuli of walking into the ICU room, I was kind of excited. I was like, yeah, I can go bring God's love, I can be that presence. So through that experience, I was able to shape my emotional reaction or response. Some of that was conscious, some of that was unconscious. But that's one example about how we can overcome fears. And I hope all of us here have various examples. So that's an approach to say that we're not just subjects or slave to our fears, and we shouldn't just run away from them every time. We should think consciously and reflect, and think about that in moderation. And there's many other examples that could come up. But that being said, so, you go back to the idea of, and I love the car example because I'm an engineer, of course, and I used to like cars a lot when I was in high school. But that understanding of, I once, really wanted a fast car, but the more I learned about money and other ways you can spend money and, seeing pictures of car wrecks and this and that, my desires changed and morphed, and now living in Michigan, I understand the value of four-wheel drive, and, so the answer for me isn't necessarily trying to get the fastest car possible. So that desire is shaped and changed with my experience. In the scriptures, a lot of people, when we think morality, we think of actions, and we've talked a lot about actions, but the scriptures speak a lot about desire, too. And that's something people think, well, as long as I'm not hurting anyone, it doesn't really matter. But the scriptures call us to a deeper sense of conversion, going all the way back to Exodus. It says, you shall not steal, you shall not kill. But the last commandments, you shall not covet. That calls us not just to do or not do stuff. It's a question of what is it we desire. And that's holding in check, unreasonable desires for maybe your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's house. Because oftentimes or inordinate or irrational, or I'm not even saying irrational, inordinate desires, that's what can lead to conflict and tension and chaos and whatnot. So the scriptures tell us that. And then Jesus tells us, you've heard it said to your ancestors, you shall not kill, and whoever kills will be liable to judgment. But I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. So again, why would Jesus be concerned with anger?
Leads to bad consequences.
Yeah. So anger, it's not necessarily to kill the other person, but when you say disrespectful things in the community, anger can cause us to, withhold charity from someone. Anger can cause us to treat other people poorly. Can hurt ourselves. So Jesus is telling us we gotta, pay attention to our desires as well. That's part of our moral life too. And again, that goes back to that virtue of temperance. And this is challenging. This is a lot more difficult than just, I didn't say anything bad, so I guess I'm okay.
I have a list of the 7 deadly sins,
Mm-hmm.
and how do those fit into all this, or do they?
I'll do a little bit more research into that. I was looking at that as I was researching this, and to be honest, I didn't quite tie all the pieces together. I'll do some research on that and get back to you, and maybe try to tie that into the next session.
And then there's the, what do they call the virtues of the spirit, or,
Yeah, there's the theological virtues. So there's the human virtues, which are 3, and then the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And we'll talk about that in the next session as well.
Here's the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah. So, and the 7 deadly sins would be, I forgot, to be honest, I'll have to do some more research.
Pride, envy, anger, sloth, avarice, gluttony, lust, vainglory.
Were they tied to virtues or gifts of the Holy Spirit?
That's separate,
I can't
I
remember.
guess. And I don't remember now why I first got this list, but.
Yeah. But there's another thing about, an example of temperance. So let's use the example of greed. So I'm the pastor of a church, and I'm trying to balance the budget, and I'm shaking people's hands after Mass. And, maybe I'm looking for someone who looks pretty well dressed, because maybe they have a little bit of money that they can help me with, I think that happens all the time in business cases where people say, who's the one in power here? Who's the one I have to really cultivate? I can just ignore the rest, So that's that sense of what's driving our desire. Is it driven out of a selfless love, a desire to be there for everyone? Because if we're not even temperate with our desires, we can oftentimes start judging people for those reasons, not being fully open to the gifts and the talents that they might bring. And there's numerous examples. I'm sure each of us in our own circumstances in life has to think about this. But again, this is tough. This is a step beyond just the 10 Commandments, if that makes sense. So we're running short of time. I'm actually gonna skip justice. You have the handouts there. So this brings us to the ultimate question: why we came here in the first place. So what is sin, anyways? And then this is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Sin is an act contrary to reason. It wounds man's nature and injures human solidarity. So it doesn't say sin is a violation of rules. It doesn't say sin is a violation of the 10 Commandments. It's true. I'm not saying that that's not what sin is. But if we only think of more morality in the sense of obligations that we have, then we don't get the full picture of what sin is. And I've kind of shown how the virtues lay out a very reasonable understanding of human happiness, the human good. So sin is what wounds us. Going all the way back to the example of the person with the invisibility cloak. We have the invisibility cloaks online. You look at a lot of the comments that people write that are very mean, behind these anonymous accounts. Are they happy? Do those comments sound like someone who's happy, comfortable, self-confident, all these traits?
I doubt it.
Yeah, it's like they're hurting inside, they want to hurt others.
Yep.
And that's what sin says. It wounds man's nature and injures solidarity. So from that own woundedness, hiding behind that sense of power that comes from the anonymous name, it injures human solidarity. So we talked about happiness. As we see happy people, they're the ones who are in solidarity with one another. And it says the root of all sins lies in man's heart. And the kinds and gravities of sins are determined principally by their objects. So we've talked a lot about how moral actions flow from desire, and it's important to pay attention to those desires that we have, because it says that's the root of sin. Lies in our heart. So that's from the in brief section. That's kind of the summary at the end of the chapter, of that chapter in the Catechism. And it says more specifically, sin is an offense against truth, reason, right conscience, failure for genuine love for God and neighbor, caused by a perverse attachment to certain goods. So I hope that gives an example. And interestingly enough, in the Catechism, the example it gives of sin is not, go read the Ten Commandments. It gives this example from Galatians. And the example is, the works of the flesh are obvious: immorality, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, hatreds, rivalry, jealousy, outbursts of fury. I could go on and on. But this sounds a whole lot more about the virtues. This is the opposite of the virtues. We read this in terms of vices. Not necessarily in terms of, did I break the sixth commandment, or was it the seventh, or was it the, It's not in terms of those obligations. It's in terms of how do we control our desires? How do we live in communion with one another? And then it says, in contrast, the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. So I'll have to do some more research to see how that... I think the deadly sins map to the gifts of the Spirit, but I'll have to do some more research because I don't know off the top of my head. So, any questions?
Well, I guess for me, I look at the Ten Commandments and I think, well, I've lived a pretty good life. But then when you get into these other things, to me, those are the things I have to be opposed to.
Yeah.
Jealousy, pride.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So those are the everyday things that I have to struggle with. Assume we all do to some extent.
Absolutely, yeah. I readily confess I do too.
I was gonna make a
Yeah.
comment. So I'm finishing up in my parish a study on Peter 1 and 2, and he definitely gets into things about sin and how to lead a virtuous life. So. And Peter's real short, so that's kind of something you could read too, to look at his teaching, which I think kind of St. Paul also. They kind of have the same goal, to bring people to Christianity, and this is what you got to do. Type of
Yeah, so the letters explore what the early life was like for the church, and that had all its tensions and interpersonal drama and factions, and so that's a very rich, just like the book of Exodus explored the people migrating out of Egypt. They explored all those tensions and factions, the same with the New Testament, except in a deeper way because it looked at life after Christ and what Christ brought about. So I'm going to do another evening next Thursday. Going to explore the theological virtues a bit. As you can see, we barely scratched the surface on some of these human virtues as well. So I don't think I'll have time to do that. That being said, I talked a lot about virtue ethics. I searched Google for a while saying, The problem with virtue ethics is it doesn't give you clear guidance or norm. I mean, it gives you the principles, but it doesn't give you specific ways to live it out in morally ambiguous situations. And I said, what are some case studies of how virtue ethics can explore moral dilemmas? And I couldn't find any, surprisingly. So if there's any moral dilemmas that you can think of, anything that might seem ambiguous or maybe not clear-cut as defined by the